Hi everyone, I'm Keith and this is my dad Kerwin. Our guest on this episode is Karama Horne, a freelance culture journalist, moderator, content creator, and the founder and host of the Blurred Girl podcast. She's also a contributing editor to Sci-Fi Wire, has been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, the San Francisco Chronicle, and Black Enterprise. She's the author of Black Panther, Protectors of Wakanda, a history and training manual of the Dora Milaje. Miss Karama, welcome to Father St. Galaxy.
Welcome.
Hi. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me. And that was an awesome intro. I think you're going to have to do all of my intros from now on because that sounded amazing.
We can write them up.
We are excited to have you. Can I just tell you up front, I love your book.
Thank you.
We both do.
Yes, absolutely. We both love your book. I don't follow the Black Panther comics like I would like to, but
you have a bunch of them.
I do, and I'm behind on reading them, but we are big fans of the film. And your book to me just gives such a rich history about Wakanda and the origins of the Black Panther. So I can't wait to talk about it with you.
That's awesome. And that makes me so happy to hear you say that because, yeah, my book is based on the comics. But as we all know, the movie is also inspired by the comics. And I try to write it for both people who are comic book fans as well as people who've never picked up a Black Panther comic before and are only familiar with the movie. And so that really makes me happy hearing you say that.
All right. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. What led you up to writing this book?
Well, that's kind of a loaded statement. Let's see. I'm going to try and think the shortest way to tell this. I actually was contacted by Marvel and they asked me to write the book, but it wasn't out of the blue. I have worked for Marvel before. So I have written forwards to comic books that are out right now. I have a couple of essays that are in a comic book run called Marvel's Voices. If you go to marvel.com, I have several essays there, one about Isaiah Bradley, another one about actually the Dora Milaje, about this very book. And I've working with them, also been on their podcast and things like that. So not many people realize this, but Marvel Comics actually farms out a lot of their prose work, like their non-comic book work, to several publishers. So the publisher that I worked with, Becker and Mayer, they happened to do a similar book, sort of like historical fiction for Star Wars. And it's called The Jedi Manual. So they were like, we're kind of looking to do the Jedi Manual, but in Wakanda with the Dora Milaje. And I was like, that's amazing, except there's not as much lore on the Dora Milaje as there are with Star Wars. So I had quite a bit of research that I had to do to sort of connect the dots between existing comic book lore and bringing together this, story about these incredible women. And it's fictional, but a lot of people keep asking me, like, are they based on real life? And it's really funny. But that makes me feel great. It makes me feel like what people are reading seems really realistic.
How much research did you do for the book, and what source material did you reference?
A lot of comics. So as you know, the book is in like several sections. So the main sections, tradition, honor, strength, courage, and compassion. So for like tradition and honor, there was a lot of history, and for that was a lot of comics. So there was the original comics that Christopher Priest wrote back in the day, because that's where he created the Dora Milaje. And I also went back to some of the stuff that Reginald Hudlin wrote and some of the stuff that Don McGregor wrote. Maybe some of those comics that you have back there in your long box, Kerwin. I'm sure I pulled from them as well. So it was sort of making sure that I had all of the canon right first. Canon is basically like the historical fiction of the characters. And then of course Ta-Nehisi Coates' run. As well as the work that Roxane Gay did, because Roxane Gay's comic book run, World of Wakanda, was really the first comic book about Wakanda told from the women's point of view and really shedding a light on the Dora Milaje. So there was a lot of research there. And then the later part of the book with like the fighting styles and some of the weaponry and things like that, that was just fun. That was just going back to like Sunday morning martial arts films that I used to watch with my dad, but also incorporating a lot of fighting styles from across the diaspora. So I think a lot of people were like, oh, you know, are you gonna have like things like Wing Chun and capoeira? And I was like, yes, but also I wanted to include like Ngudi stick fighting, as well as like Haitian machete, like all of these things. There's fighting styles that are within the continent of Africa and across the diaspora that I really wanted to include to give it an international feel.
Got it. Yeah, I do have maybe one or two of the Christopher Priest comics, and a majority of them are the Ta-Nehisi Coates version of the series. Yeah.
And I think a lot of people got back into reading him after the movie, which is, that makes sense, you know? But in a lot of what I think Ryan Coogler did in the first movie does reference a lot of Ta-Nehisi Coates' work.
Yes. Well, as I said earlier, you know, your book paints such a rich history of Wakanda and the origins of the Black Panther. And I want to focus on two women in particular. And if you could just tell us about Nahanda the Wise and her contribution to the formation of Dora Milaje.
You know what's really funny is that you actually just brought up one of the things I'm most proud about the book, because that isn't in the comics. That is actually something I got to make up. So Nahanda is in the comics. Nahanda was created by, and when I say Nahanda, I'm not talking about the real life Nahanda, who was a priestess who fought against colonialism, but the woman who she's named after in the comics, Nahanda, was created by Ta-Nehisi Coates in his run. What I wanted to do, because as you saw, there's like that whole history of all the different kings and queens and Black Panthers of Wakanda. Nahanda is important because in Ta-Nehisi Coates' run, he names her a one of the Black Panthers. And it's funny because in another Fantastic Four comic book, Jonathan Hickman had named T'Challa, King of the Dead. And he did this at one point when T'Challa had lost his powers and Shuri became Black Panther. But T'Challa still had work to do, and he didn't want to usurp his sister's power. So he went to Boss, and Boss named him King of the Dead. When he did that, when Boss did that, Black Panther was able to access all of the previous kings and queens, kind of like Avatar: The Last Airbender. Like when he goes into Avatar state, can talk to all of the previous avatars. So what I was fascinated by was this woman that showed up, Nahanda. And the fact that there was only one woman at the time represented in this vast history of Wakanda. And then you see her pop up in other comic books. She was running around with Thor and running, you know, in like 1000 AD Avengers. Like Nahanda keeps popping up as this early Black Panther, but she's the only woman. And I was like, there's gotta be something to that. There really has gotta be something to that. And so I came up with the story of, what if Nahanda was the creator of the Dora Milaje? The history that we hear about in the comics is that they were considered potential brides of the king. T'Challa and no other king ever married them, but what they did was to keep the peace amongst the different tribes of Wakanda, or city-states, as you will. They would choose one woman from each group to represent themselves in the city, and they could potentially be trained to become part of the Dora Milaje. I wanted to just extend that story a little bit and say, what if a woman created them, and why would she have created them? And I was fascinated by and inspired by a real life story about the Mujaji people of South Africa. And the Mujaji people it's a matrilineal society, and they worship the rain goddess Mujaji. And I could be saying that wrong. I apologize for those of you who are Zulu who know the proper pronunciation. I've only seen it written. But this rain goddess is known for, it's a matrilineal group of priestesses, specifically a high priestess who is responsible for communing with this goddess. And this is like in real life. So what I found was a story about one of the earliest Mujaji priestesses who was challenged by the men in her tribe, and someone tried to kill her. And she basically from that point on only kept women around her and called them her brides. And it wasn't brides in the sense of they were married to her in the way we look at marriage here. It's a concept of commitment. And so I basically took that concept and sort of transposed it into my fictional history of Nahanda and said she was the first female Black Panther, and not everybody was happy with that. And somebody tried to kill her, and someone in her court saved her life. And from that point on, she decided to have only women be her consorts, let's say, like basically take care of her. And she chose one barren woman from every tribe because she knew women who couldn't have children were probably, not looked upon as highly as those who could have children. And also that would give each city-state a chance to be represented in court, in the palace. So I was really excited to be able to like take that real life story and like sort of mold it to create canon. I was very surprised because I thought that was the one story that Marvel was going to say, yeah, you can't do that. But they didn't. They loved it. And I'm thrilled because hopefully at some point somebody will write a comic about it.
Tell us about Dora Zola a little bit and the story behind her encounter with Ramonda, who we know as the future queen of Wakanda, that led Zola to her greatest achievement.
What's interesting is that's another, you guys are picking out the great stuff. This is something else I was able to, she's not a character I was able to create, but it's a story I was able to create based on two stories that already existed. So let's go back to the comics for a second. In Roxane Gay's World of Wakanda, Mistress Zola was the head of the Dora Milaje school. But if you read that comic, spoiler alert, she doesn't make it to the end. Someone kills her. In Evan Narciss's run of Black Panther, and I believe it's the Rise of the Black Panther, when he was out scouting the borderlands with his son, he was pretty young. T'Challa's pretty young, probably about your age, Keith. And what happened was he lost him. And when I say he lost him, there was a whole group of people. It was not just T'Chaka, but the Hattusaraze, his security. There were Dora Milaje there. There were other people around, obviously border tribesmen. And all of a sudden, T'Challa was missing. And he's missing for a whole day. And he just basically ran off and was really being curious, but fell asleep in the reeds. So nobody could see him. It was very tall grass. So what ended up happening was, of course, as a parent, T'Chaka was panicked. And he ends up in that comic book run just getting rid of the Dora altogether because he's so angry that they lost his child. What happens is Ramonda, who is actually a South African citizen who is trying to find more people to plead her cause to, because at the time she is dealing with apartheid South Africa and she's walking up, and I don't want to say up and down Africa, I'm saying she's going to she's on a pilgrimage trying to find people to help save her country. She stumbles upon this little boy in the grass and wakes him up and basically brings him back to the castle. And T'Chaka, he doesn't marry her right away, but he gets to know her and convinces her to stay because they want to reward the woman who brought his child home. But what's interesting in that run of the comics is when they do reinstate the Dora, they in my book, I made it so that, someone had to pay the price for that mistake being made. And the person who paid the price in my story is Mistress Zola. But because of that, she goes on to start the school that helps to train Dora and basically formalize their training. It's not like they weren't trained before, but she opens the school and basically formalizes their training from that point on. And I just love the fact that I was able to take these different stories that were built before me and bring them together in the book.
And that's interesting because, again, because I don't have as much knowledge of Black Panther in the comics, I was not aware that T'Challa and Shuri have two different mothers. So T'Challa's mother, she was, of course, the queen at one point, but she passed away at a very early age, which makes sense because of the gap in age. When you see Chadwick Boseman and Letitia Wright, there's about maybe a 15, 20-year gap in between. I was wondering, well, why is the gap? Why is that such a large gap? But it's because, they come from two different mothers. And yeah, it's just an incredible, brilliant story, how it's written. And it just enlightened me when I read the story. That's why I'm so excited about talking about the history of these two women. It's just wonderful. It makes sense now, bringing it all together.
It does. And what's fascinating is the other thing that I also love that is, yes, Niamey, who died when T'Challa was young, doesn't get talked about in the the MCU because she was really a comic book character. But I will say what is true in the comics, which is very true of a lot of families across the diaspora, is that they don't say stepmother or stepfather. That's not a term that would be used in Wakanda. This is your mother now, and I love that concept. Not that it's ignoring his birth mother, but it's after someone makes transition, as I say, death is not the end. That's said a lot, within the Black Panther lore. They still honor his biological mother, but yes, Shuri's mother, Ramonda, is who he really sees as his mother because she really raised him. He remembers his mother, but he recognizes Ramonda as his mother too. And then you're correct. Shuri is the child that she had with T'Chaka. And then when T'Chaka is taken from her, they truly become even closer because they all share, T'Chaka's memory and T'Chaka's, they honor T'Chaka as well.
Yeah, and that's portrayed so very well in the film. Absolutely. And one other, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And one other story in the book that I was not aware of, there's a section of the Dora Milaje called the Midnight Angels. Can you tell us who they are and what's their purpose?
Well, it's interesting. Again, from the comics, there were two different sets of Midnight Angels. One, their origins actually come from a storyline called Doom War, a comic book run written by a man named Jonathan Mayberry. And this is actually around that same time when Shuri was Black Panther and T'Challa, he was still king, but he wasn't the Panther. He had a different set of powers that were given to him by the ancestors. And so together they fought a character named Victor Von Doom, who, if you're a comic book reader, he's the guy in like the big metal suit who was after vibranium. That's been a lot in the comics. Everybody wants vibranium because it's this unlimited resource. It is also really, really rare, which makes it, highly valuable. So he was trying to usurp all of the vibranium from Wakanda. And first, he attacked T'Challa, who had to recover. In his recovery, Shuri becomes Black Panther. And then together they have to fight him off because he has planted people in their midst that are basically turning Wakandans against him. And what's interesting about this whole war is that because all of their weapons, everything was made of vibranium, Doom was also a master scientist. So he figured out how to use vibranium against them in this comic book run. So they had to come up with a fighting style that was completely different, could outsmart all of Dr. Doom's robots and everything, who had like photographic memories and stuff. He had to find ways the Dora had to train in a new way. And then they had to come up with weapons that work completely differently. And that's how the Midnight Angels were born. They were basically this elite group of Dora Milaje only about 4 or 5 of them that were like this wetworks team. And they were basically, they had a different set of fighting styles and different weapons. They could fight with vibranium weapons as well as steel weapons that were laced with basically, let's say magic. Let's just say there were magic weapons, because they were particle weapons that were basically forged between the science and spirituality of Wakanda. And it was really a fascinating run. So that's how they were born. And when I say born, I mean, obviously they were not young, but that's where they came from. And it's really funny because they got to fight alongside Deadpool, which is one thing that one day I hope we get to see on TV, because the Dora Milaje and Deadpool would be hilarious. But then the other thing that happened was Ta-Nehisi Coates built upon that story and created 2 new Midnight Angels, but it really started with the armor. So if you've ever seen the Dora Milaje with the blue armor with like blue masks and almost like blue plumes of feathers that are coming off their bodies, they can fly, they can go underwater, things like that. There's special mech suits that were made during Ta-Nehisi Coates' run that 2 Dora, Io and Aneka rather, stole in order to try and save Wakanda as T'Challa was trying to defend it from another angle, basically. And you also learn a lot about those Midnight Angels in Roxane Gay's run as well. So there's 2 sets of Midnight Angels. I think most people are more familiar with the comic book versions. I'm sorry, the Ta-Nehisi Coates comic book run, the blue masked versions. But yeah, they're these really, really high-tech suits. And it's not so much that they're not part of the Dora Milaje, they are allowed to work outside of the rules that the Dora are bound by.
So they're kind of like the freelancers of the Dora Milaje.
A little bit. They're a little bit like independent contractors, but when you need them, they like when you call them, they are coming, weapons ready.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting that you brought up Victor Von Doom, because his name does appear numerous times in your book. So I wanted to know, why did you want to bring up Victor Von Doom in your book? How does it relate? Knowing what we know about the history of Von Doom and Wakanda, tell us why you wanted this to relate and what's in the book.
That story that I just told you is one of the biggest ones that involve the Dora. And so there's a lot of things that I reference, because in terms of the Dora Milaje, I think when going through the comics, you regularly see like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 Dora with the king or the queen, or even the princess, even Princess Shuri. But in Doom War, there were like 500 Dora Milaje. So in terms of their history, it really affected them. Like the Dora are actually an army, and people, I don't think, have recognized that, because so far on, in the movies and even on like Falcon and Winter Soldier, you've only seen like 4 or 5. So for the comic book heads out there, I wanted them to be able to see, yes, I'm talking about these Dora that came through this, like so many Dora gave their lives and so many more had to be initiated after that fight, because of just, it almost decimated Wakanda. So it was a huge deal. So that's sort of like a little Easter egg for a comic book heads out there.
I love Easter eggs, especially because we always knew from the movies that the Dora Milaje was huge, especially from their scenes in Infinity War and Endgame, but we never knew that there were like 500 at a time. We always assumed it was like, the 4 or 5 that we mainly knew, and then the like 100 we saw in Infinity War. But there's way more than that. This book gives us a little bit of a more in-depth look at the history of that, and a more in-depth look at their training process, which I really enjoyed.
Yeah, no, and that was important to me, because I think it's always like they're there, but like, okay, how did they get there? They have their own helicarrier. Great. Who flies it? Who maintains it? If they speak 6 or 7 languages, how do they learn them? So there's all these different things that I was seeing, and that was sort of helped inspire the book, both in the comics, because the same thing happened in the comics. In the comics, it's like they would just be there. Like T'Challa would be there and they'd be standing in the back with spears, and even little things like Okoye says, that she does in the comics and in the movies, she says she doesn't like guns, like, ugh, so primitive. But then there's other perspectives. There's another, like, Aneka doesn't like them because if you have a gun and it's using vibranium bullets, and vibranium is a precious resource, and you don't want it to fall in the hands of an enemy, if you shoot somebody, you got to go dig out that bullet. We don't have time for that. You know what I mean? So it's like just trying to think of different ways around it. I think I had the most fun with the weapons. Like, everybody knows about the, Komoyo beads that are on the wrist, but I'm like, why would they only be on the wrist? Why wouldn't they be a necklace? Why wouldn't they be in my hair? Like, why couldn't they have extended ones that could be a whip? And they were like, Marvel was very open to me just coming up with all kinds of stuff, which was a lot of fun.
Awesome. So the Dora Milaje are, like we said, highly skilled and trained to protect the leaders and the people of Wakanda, all 5 tribes. But they live very stressful lives, always under constant pressure of attacks, doom, and Namor.
Yes.
And Namor, yes.
All the insane things that happen in Wakanda. Everyone always tries to steal the vibranium. And being a Dora Milaje is hard. So what are some things they can do to maintain their mental health?
Well, that was also very important for me to cover in the book. The courage chapters and compassion chapters, I actually think they're two of the most important and two of the most relatable. I'm fascinated with characters that don't have superpowers, that are very similar to like us, but they just have access to really cool stuff. So like Iron Man and things like that. But the Dora, if you're not fighting, or you, like I said, you lose a sister in battle, how do you mourn? What do you do with that? And some of that was represented in the comics, but I wanted to make it part of their training, that mourning is part of your process. Rest is part of your process. Even though you train to stay ready, you're also training your mind. And also, if you don't have control of your mind, it doesn't matter how many weapons you have. If you're up against, an X-Man or somebody that has psychic powers, psionic powers, sonic powers, like, you have to be able to have just as much control over your mind as you do over your body. And I think that has a lot to do with the downtime. And the other thing I also wanted to cover was, what if someone gets injured, or, how do they recover? How long do they recover? Or what if they are injured to the point that they can't go back out in the field? That doesn't mean there's no use for them. Where do they go? What do they do? And that's the kind of stuff that I also wanted to cover in the book.
And I think I already covered this, but I wanted to talk to you about what was your favorite part of the book. What did you enjoy writing? But it sounds like it's the weapons section. Is that right?
Well, it was 3 things. So yes, the weapons section was a lot of fun. Creating Nahanda, and not creating Nahanda, but having Nahanda be the founder of the Dora. I'm so happy I was able to create that canon. And then there was a character that I was able to create that is Jabari. And I shouldn't say I created her. I would say that it's a character that existed in the comics. There's so many characters that are like side characters, secondary characters. I'm a huge fan of secondary characters, as you can see. And she was a secondary character in a book, and I was able to sort of make this whole story about her, because we always hear about Wakanda and Zana, like the main golden city and everything like that. And we talk about Jabari briefly, but there are, my book encompasses women that have come from all over to become Dora. And it was important that I also showed Jabari, and Jabari in the comics are based on the Igbo people of Nigeria. So their language is different. And the Jabari in the, remember, M'Baku lives in the mountains, so it's cold there. So this particular trainee that I was able to sort of give a story to has a lot of things that she has to overcome. She doesn't speak the language, the main languages. She has to learn. She's shorter than the rest of the other trainees. She has to learn to use like what she has to create a whole new, training, like interpret the training that she's given to succeed. And I was really a fan of that, because I think we kind of tend to look at, the tallest, the biggest, the strongest. And that character was very important to me because she's not. She's short, she's thick, she's trying to, like, the staffs are like 3 times her height, and she's got to figure out how to achieve, and she does. And I think it's I was really thankful to be able to create that character as well.
Well, one of our favorite parts of the book. So we're big Marvel fans. We love the films. Right. And I know that a majority of your material comes from the comic books, but we were able to find a connection to the film. And that was the story about Azuri the Wise.
Yes.
All right. And this was when Captain America and Wakanda were fighting the Nazis back in World War II. So there's a history there with Captain America and Wakanda. And it's just fitting to see many years later, Cap is working alongside the descendant of the Black Panther to fight Thanos, right?
And they get the shield.
Avengers.
T'Challa's like, get this man a shield.
Exactly right. And that's right. And that's exactly what happened the first time Cap and Wakanda and the king at the time fought together, that in honor of Cap being so brave and fighting alongside the Wakandans against the Nazis, they created for him his first shield made out of vibranium.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what's really funny. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say real quick. I believe in the movies, didn't Howard Stark make his shield?
I think in the TV show, I think that's what they put that in one of the TV shows. Right. I think that was in Falcon and Winter Soldier. What's interesting about that storyline when Cap meets when Azuri meets the Howling Commandos, that story was written by Reginald Hudlin in the comics. And so that was fascinating. He's now one of the heads of Milestone Comics, and he was directing movies back in the 90s like House Party and stuff like that. So it's just really interesting how sort of some of those storylines have still made their way. And that's what I think is so fantastic about the Wakanda lore, is what I call it now, is because, I mean, I'll be honest, these characters were created by 2 white guys back in the 70s, like 60s rather. So, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, and they did an incredible job for what it was at the time. But the fact that Marvel has now asked a lot of Black creators to continue the storyline and build out the world of Wakanda, I just think is fantastic. And I'm honored to actually be one of those people.
So we actually have some extra questions.
Okay.
That the super producer just came up with. 2 questions. Firstly, who are your favorite characters from the book and why did you admire them? And secondly, what advice do you have for aspiring writers like me?
Goodness, I feel like I've mentioned all the favorite characters. Okay, so Nahanda is still definitely one of my favorite characters. And gosh, I think it's has to be Nahanda. Like, I'm literally looking at the book now, trying to see if I could like change my own mind. But my favorite character from the book is Nahanda for the reasons that I mentioned. I'm also very happy that I was able to include all 16 kings and queens of Wakanda, because I think like a lot of people only know T'Challa, T'Chaka, and Azuri, as you mentioned. And Nnedi Okorafor created Queen Turkana, and she's in the book. And I also, all of these kings and queens have been mentioned in various ways between Ta-Nehisi Coates and Jonathan Hickman, and a little bit by Jonathan Mayberry. But what I was able to do is give them little backstories and put them in chronological order, which was a lot of work, because I had to figure out, because as we all know, there's publication history, meaning when comics come out, and then there's canonical history, canon history, like when stories happen, and people write flashbacks all the time. So the moment I thought I would have the timeline down, I'd read a flashback and it's like, darn it, I got to start over. So put a lot of work into that, and I was excited by that. So I would say just the kings and queens of Wakanda, and including Nahanda, my favorite characters. And how to write. Well, honestly, just write. I think at one point in time, there would have been like, hey, if you're going to write, you need to choose the kind of, I mean, you still should choose the kind of writing you want to do. One that you want to, do fantasy writing, or, be a journalist, or, be a horror writer, still pick what area you want to be in, concentrate on that, and then read a lot of what you want to do, and then just start writing. Fan fiction is huge. There's a lot of movies and shows that have started by fan fiction. And by fan fiction, I mean, like, if you look at websites like Archive of Our Own or fanfiction.net, there's a lot of stories that regular folks write that are about characters you already know about, because it's easier to write about a story where you don't have to write the backstory. But it's I've seen a lot of people start there and then start creating their own original characters. But I think if there's never been a better time to be an independent creator because of social media. So I'm not saying give all your characters away or your plot points away, but you can, and with, enough of a following, you can encourage people to buy the comic or book that you've created on your own through Kickstarter, or even, Amazon creative publishing. Like, there are so many entries and ways to tell your story, even short stories on Wattpad. And I know a lot of people who have been creating their own independent comics through things like webtoons. So there's so many different ways of writing stories now that I don't think you are the only limitation to what you can achieve.
Wow. Nice. Can I quote you on that?
Sure.
Very cool advice, right? Do we have any other questions?
We do.
Okay.
So I want to get a little more in depth with these characters. So in which characters do you see yourself?
There is one character that, for fans who know me, is sort of based on me. That's for like anybody who's listening who has been following me for a long time, you'll know exactly who that is. But in terms of the character that responds to things like I would say that's Asura. And Asura, to those of you who are older comic book readers, is known as Queen Divine Justice back in the day. But when Ta-Nehisi Coates took over that character, she is a Jabari princess that actually was taken out of Wakanda for her own safety when she was a child and raised in the States. So what's funny about her is, in the book, if you see, that's the other thing I forgot to mention, there's a lot of different people who make notes in the margins of the book. She makes notes in the margins. She's very sarcastic, and she talks a lot like I talk. One thing I forgot to mention also is the book is a journal that would be given to Dora Milaje when they enter the school, and then make notes, have other people make notes in it. And then upon graduation, you would give your journal to a Dora Milaje that's entering the school. So the cycle continues. And this book is supposed to be a found journal that happens after several wars, after Namor has been there, after Doom has been there. And so they're starting the school over again with a new headmistress, because, as we mentioned, Mistress Zola passed away. But I was able to use some of the notes of Mistress Zola in there as well. So that's the other thing that I think is also kind of special about the book. It's using that very African concept of the older taking care of the younger, and vice versa.
Okay, well, I think that's all for this episode.
Okay, well.
Wow, I'm so sad to end this. Any other questions? Somebody?
From your super producer?
No.
Sorry, I think we've taken up enough of your time today.
Can I just tell you?
You need to sleep.
Karama, you've written a wonderful book. It's a book that I will reference again and again. I love books like this that just provides just detailed information about the history of certain Marvel characters, and it makes me want to go back and finish reading my Ta-Nehisi series, read anything else from any of the previous authors. So just thank you so much for being on this podcast. Do you have anything coming up?
I have let's see. Well, I'm a co-host of a horror podcast on Travel Channel called Pop Paranormal. So for those of you who are interested in horror movies, even if you're too scared to watch them, you probably can deal with the podcast. That's something I do regularly. And I do have a project coming up, but I think you're going to have to follow me on social because I can't talk about it just yet. It's a pretty big one and I'm really excited. But follow me as the Blurred Girl, THEBLERD, all over social. For the time being, Twitter, not sure how much longer staying there, but Instagram as well as TikTok. That's where you can find me and follow me for all the information. But yeah, I'm still running around signing, doing signings as much as possible. If you would like a signed copy of the book, you definitely need to follow me on social because in my profile, I am selling signed copies. But if you just want to get a bunch of copies for your family and friends for the holidays, you can buy Protectors of Wakanda, History and Training Manual of Dora Milaje, anywhere fine books are sold. And I appreciate the support.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for writing this book. Where can people find us?
So you already know where to find us if you listen to us, but just to recap, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Radio Public, Amazon Music, ... or wherever else you get your podcasts. Check out our socials, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Bothersome Galaxy. Visit our website, bothersomegalaxy.com. Please donate to our Patreon page so we can keep making the same awesome content we do. Keep bringing you these awesome interviews. Check out our speaker page too. And we are excited to announce our merch store. So for about another week or so, you can claim 15% off on all merchandise in the store. So you should buy now before the sale goes away.
And thank you so much. If you are a follower on YouTube, please like and subscribe. But Karama Horne, thank you again, the author of a Black Panther Protector of Wakanda, A History of the Training Manual of the Dora Milaje. Thank you so much for being on our podcast.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Okay, everyone. Thank you so much once again. So until next time, take care.
And
we will see you again.